one of the challenges of being a pastor is that you're always giving, but oftentimes not receiving.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by Dr. Richard Blackaby today.
Yes, that's Sam, the disaster relief surveyor.
I got the chance to, as many of you probably know by now, there's been a few disasters in the southeast for sure. But I was in the southeast area of Georgia with the Georgia Baptist disaster relief team. I was a lowly, what they call an SUV, a spontaneous, untrained volunteer. But I had a day that worked out, and it was only about a 2.5 hour drive from me in Vidalia. And I went down with my brother, and we, just sort of did some assessments on, people still have trees on their houses. A lot of people still without power. There's just, it's unreal even there. And probably most folks haven't heard of that area as far as the devastation there. It's not getting the press like Asheville and those places, which are obviously much worse, but it's still 2 weeks after the hurricane comes through, and a lot of people still don't have power.
No power. Yeah, that's awesome. That just the magnitude of that destruction was just
it's unreal.
They're saying up in North Carolina they're calling it a 1,000-year flood. You don't get those once every 1,000 years. So
it's crazy.
But what an opportunity just to show the love of God and just being on the ground with people.
It was really
well. It was really nice of your boss let you have time to go do that.
It was very generous of him to allow me to serve others. But maybe just a couple of quick things. Are still a few spots left at the coaching workshop that we have coming up at the end of the month. But you better hurry. Time is running out for that. But that'll be October 28th to 30th. Yeah, and that's happening at First Baptist Jonesboro. You can find out more.
And I'm in town, so I get to drop in and speak each day. And
there'll be a dinner. I think we're having a dinner with you that first night, Monday night. So that'll be good. And then also, hopefully there'll be a lot of repairs made. But you're going to be up in Asheville in the spring in March. Teaching there out of Revelation, which is perhaps fitting, appropriate for the level of apocalyptic devastation that's taking place in that area.
I think on the podcast recently, I think I used the wrong date too. I think I said it was March 14 to 16 next in 2025, but it's actually March 24 to 26, and so that's still out there a bit. If you search in March at the Cove, it'll pull it up. But I've heard some, even just this morning, I was hearing from some folks that were talking about coming, and it looks like it's going to be a really fascinating group of people all studying Revelation together in a beautiful place. And so the Cove and Ridgecrest, which is another conference center I was supposed to speak at next week, just outside of Asheville, they both canceled all conferences in October, and they're just housing disaster relief volunteers for that area instead. So
there's just if there's anything folks listening can do, there's lots of great organizations to donate to,
and a lot of those, especially like we're Southern Baptist, but a lot of those disaster relief agencies like that, they're already funded, so they don't need you to pay money for their administration. Like, you give them money and they go buy blankets and do repairs. Like, it all goes straight to relief. And so I always like organizations like that are their operations are already funded, so any gifts you give just go straight into supplies that going to the people in need. So
well, you mentioned October, which happens to be, as I found out recently,
my wife's birthday.
Several people's birthday. My sister's birthday. My sister-in-law's birthday.
Got it.
A couple of sister-in-law birthdays. Happening month. But one other thing that also happens in the month of October is Pastor Appreciation.
It is, and the pastors, deservedly so, get an entire month to be appreciated. And I thought, Sam, it might be interesting, as someone that's been a pastor. I grew up in a pastor's home. I minister to pastors all the time. I've had many a late night meal, tearful conversation with pastors just carrying a huge load. And so I do know something about what pastors carry. And you might be saying to yourself, well, why do pastors get a whole month of appreciation? What about me? I'm a plumber, I'm a school teacher, I'm something else. And I think a lot of those professions, especially teachers, have a focus. But I would say that if you, hopefully all of our listeners have a pastor. Hopefully we're all involved somewhere in a church. But I would like just maybe to say a few things about that. If you are a pastor, then what I'm going to share, I'm sure will resonate with you. And if you have a pastor, then here's some things perhaps just for you to think about as well. But first, just to maybe share, why is it hard to be a pastor? When I grew up, when I was just a kid, it seemed like a great gig. You kind of showed up at the church on Sunday and you preached this great sermon.
Full salary, work one day a week.
Work 1 day a week.
What's not to love?
You stand at the back and everybody effuses about how wonderful it was, and a few widows drop off a homemade pie or something for you, and it's all good,
Yeah.
But as I became a pastor later,
was that not your experience, Richard?
Yes, no.
I sense a change in tune here.
There was a little bit more to being a pastor than what I had seen first as
less
a child.
Pies than you.
I have
been led to believe.
I have had the occasional pie actually, but not nearly as many as I would have hoped for. And so, a couple things I would just say. One is being a pastor is a very unique role. It's unlike most other professions. And again, it's not to downplay someone who's a Christian business person, Christian university professor or something. I'm not saying that necessarily they're more important, but there are some things that make being a pastor somewhat unique. And one of those is that it's a calling. And again, I would say there is a sense where if you're a public school teacher, if you're a fireman, you're a policeman, you're in the military, those are also callings, and you can truly feel called by God to exercise your gifts and to invest your life that way to the glory of God. But sometimes for a lot of us, it might be that we were looking for a career that would pay well, and there was room for advancement, and there seemed like there was a shortage of flight attendants or pilots or something, or firemen, and so we chose that career to earn a living. Whereas as a pastor, you typically do, there are some, I suspect, that do the same thing and choose that as a career. But for the most part, it's something you feel that God has specifically called you to do. And I remember very, very vividly when I began to be terrified that God might want me to do that, because I didn't really want to do that. And I've known many people that were running from that particular call. But
I feel like that tends to be a common, it's like, please, Lord, anything but be a pastor.
Yeah,
and there you go.
Of course, there's a lot of folks that are terrified of public speaking alone. And so being called to do something like that, and a lot of people that become pastors, that's their least favorite thing to do. They love going to the hospital and they love ministering to folks, encouraging them. But sometimes the pressure of standing up in front of the whole congregation and week after week can be a real burden. And so, and the other thing that makes it hard sometimes is just because you're called to be a minister doesn't mean you're necessarily a very strong leader. And Sam, you and I know that there's a number of churches struggling and a number of pastors who struggle. And sometimes even their church kind of withers up under their leadership. And at times pastors even have to shut the doors of a church. And I'll tell you, that's pretty devastating if you're not succeeding at what God called you to do. If that's your divine calling and you failed at your divine calling. And unfortunately, that does happen where... and for a lot of reasons we could get into, but there is a sense of calling. So it's not like a pastor just kind of flips around from job to job. I tried my hand at pastoring. That didn't go so well. So now I'm a telemarketer, and I think I might go into try to become a flight attendant next. And, that's not quite the same. There's a calling, whether you want to do it, whether you feel like you're good at it or not. Sometimes you just feel, but that's what God has asked me to do, and I don't have a choice. And also, the second thing is that it typically, not always, but typically it requires quite a bit of education. The it's changing somewhat, and there's always people that don't follow the norm. But typically, you'd have a 4-year college degree, and then you'd get about a 3-year or 4-year master's degree on top of that. So you'd probably on a minimum, the standard has been about 7 years of training. Now, if you're borrowing money to get that degree, that many years in school, in the legal profession, in law school or medical school, would at least ultimately give you some earning capacity to pay off some of those student loans. But 7 years of post-high school education and then getting paid a pastor's salary, a church planter's salary, you may have that debt hanging over your head for a long time to come. And so you invest a lot at the front end, but it's one of the lower paying professions in terms of education. And so again, that can be a little burdensome because you're educated to be a white collar minister, but often you're paid not at a white collar salary, and so that's difficult. A third thing would just be that it's expensive in a lot of ways to do that kind of role. I know when I became a pastor and I was preaching every week, I only had about one decent suit, but you kind of have to change things up a little bit. You got to have a bit of a wardrobe. Now, typically pastors don't have a wardrobe budget. You got to go out and buy all those clothes yourself, and you need to be reading books. And stronger churches may have a book allowance, but a lot of smaller churches don't. And so you're not being paid well, but you got to stay up, and you got to be buying books and staying current and dressing at least respectably, even if it's a little more casual now than my day. You wore a suit and tie all the time. You still have to have decent looking clothes that are different week by week, and you got to have a decent car. You got to go to the hospital. You got to drive out to this meeting. You got to be here and there and all over the place, and then just a lot of times. I mean, it depends on the church, but especially smaller churches, people kind of expect to be invited to your home or to have a meal with you, and so there's a lot of expenses around that. And I know when I first started out as a pastor, I didn't have very much expense account at all, but I was meeting. My wife and I'd meet a senior adult couple for coffee, and we just would pay out of our own pocket, and we weren't paid a whole lot, and we weren't. There were just a lot of things that we just did that, again, it could be a financial hardship, which a lot of other professions you might never have that. You show up at the work site and everything's covered, but when you're a pastor, it can be amazing how a lot of times, again, especially in smaller settings. If someone meets you for lunch, they kind of expect that the pastor is going to pay, but it might be that person might make more money than the pastor, but
sure,
it's kind of expected that way. And so that's another one. And then also just time pressures are somewhat unique on a pastor because they certainly aren't working 9 to 5. They don't get weekends off, especially on a Sunday or whenever their services are. Whereas others on the weekend might have it all off. Purely up to them how they want to spend their time. For a pastor, that's often their biggest day, and so they've got to get to church early. They've got to prepare. I remember when we used to do baptisms, I'd often have to swing by and make sure that the heat pump was going in time and the water was full, and again, it's changed somewhat over the years, but I'll tell you, when my dad was a pastor, and this wasn't really to his credit, but if the family was sitting down to have dinner and the phone rang, of course, we didn't even have call display back then. It was just a landline, and you didn't know who was on the other end until you answered. And so my dad, as a pastor, just always felt like, well, what if it's a crisis? What if someone is being rushed to the hospital or whatever? I better answer. And then there were many times where we didn't see Dad till the end of the meal. We got up and went on our way, and Dad was finally coming back around to have to microwave his dinner. And so same with summers. It's some school teachers often might get the summer off, even if it's been a crazy school year for them. But I remember, like with my dad, there was one year we had a lot of college students, and there had to be like 13 weddings over the summer. Like he never had a Saturday free the entire summer. He was the main pastor, couldn't really pawn that off. And so all of his, even if he was on vacation, he had to get back in time for the rehearsal Friday night and the wedding Saturday.
Wow.
And people want you to stay for the reception afterward and visit with family, or same with funerals. The funerals especially, they don't pop up just, weddings at least you can kind of schedule out. But funerals happen whenever, or someone has a heart attack and they're raced to the hospital. I had those calls where I raced to the hospital and found a church member on a gurney in the hallway waiting to get processed. And so you never know. You're always just one phone call away, one text away from being on the job, having to head out. The phone could ring at early in the morning. It could ring late at night. It could ring on your birthday. It could ring your day off. And I remember one point we had kind of a denominational missionary that preached for me one Sunday when I was away, and I didn't know he was going to do this, but he thought he would help me out, and so he really got after my people for calling me on my day off, and said my day off then was Thursday, and he was like, you Thursdays just need to leave him alone. He's the pastor. He and his wife need some time. And so all that did was that every time someone called me on Thursday after that, they would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know this is your day off." And then they would proceed just to go ahead and tell you what they wanted to anyway. But so all that to say is it's different that way. You're always on call.
Right.
The phone could ring at any time, and they're distraught and they want their pastor, and you can't say, "I know you've just had the worst day of your life, but could we schedule a meeting a week from this Wednesday to talk about it?" They want that now.
Right.
A fifth thing is that your family is always under scrutiny. Your wife, if you're a man and you're the pastor, your wife is not necessarily paid a dime to be at that church, but it's assumed that it's a package deal.
Well, it's expected.
And that she will always be there, and even if she's got a sick kid or she's feeling not well, people wonder, well, where's your wife tonight? And they'll expect her to serve. Although her husband is going to be away a lot as it is, and she's going to be having to take care of all the kids, she's still expected to also serve and be responsible for some things, and the kids are in a fishbowl as well. I grew up in that fishbowl, and you acted out as just a normal kid, and you'd hear, well, as the pastor's son, I'm just disappointed, Richard, that you would do that.
But I'm sure you never.
Well,
had
they said that to
but
some
you
of my
overheard
brothers.
that. Oh,
some of my
sure.
brothers were wounded deeply by that. I
know.
tried to comfort them as best I could.
You do what you can, Richard.
Yes. And so, but that has driven some kids far from God because of the pressure, the expectation, or they're just very good naturedly just saying, "Richard, do you think God's calling you to be a pastor just like your dad as well?" And so those kind of scrutiny, you do feel the pressure, and it is hard if you've ever had to preach. I know a lot of pastors who hate preaching Father's Day sermons because if they use any example from their own family about what a great dad they are, a great husband they are, the whole church is watching and looking for the exception, and will be happy to point out to you a shortfall if they see it. So and it can be not that much fun living in that family where everybody's looking to the pastor just preached a whole series of how to raise godly children, and now everybody's watching to see if there's any chinks in his own kids where they're not as godly as the pastor said they were. Lots of pressure there in the family. And a sixth thing is that you also minister in a village of supervisors, and it's funny to me because I've watched a couple of legal programs on TV, so that doesn't make me an expert in law. I don't typically give lawyers, attorneys, counsel because I used to watch Perry Mason or something years ago. Law and Order now. But a lot of people feel like because they go to church that they're kind of an expert on what pastors should do. And you may never have preached a sermon, but you've got lots of critiques about how the pastor preached his. And you've never been to seminary, but you heard somewhere on the radio once, and your theology doesn't quite line up now with what the pastor said. And And so people who've never pastored, never led in a church, never been to seminary, but they all have an opinion about how you do your job.
Yeah.
And you might be the only guy who's been to seminary, the only guy who's ever been a pastor, and yet everybody's got an opinion. And people will even leave the church because you didn't rise to their standard of what they were looking for. And so obviously you can have your own sense of what you need as in a pastor, but oftentimes people act as if they really know better than you do. And probably if they weren't busy working at that store, they could do a better job than you are right now. But and so that can be a little frustrating. And especially in smaller churches where there's a congregational votes on everything, where you might get an unwed single mom living in poverty that is voting on your salary increase or something, or someone that's unemployed or whatever else, someone in an entirely different line of work, or maybe no education and very low salary, but they can feel, well, I don't know why the pastor should get a raise. I didn't get a raise this year. That can drive you a little crazy too. And maybe you're doing a great job and the church is booming, but they kind of resent the fact they didn't get a cost of living increase, so why should the pastor? And when you're a congregational sort of system and everybody, no matter what their calling, whatever their work is, that they have a say, they're, in a sense, they're your boss because they can vote in a business meeting, that can lead to all kinds of struggles sometimes for a pastor. Just a couple other ones. A seventh one is that they're just enormous stakes. I mean, when someone is calling and their marriage might end in divorce, and you're the one they're calling to try to save their marriage, or they've got a prodigal child and they're heartbroken over them, or there's someone, maybe they've got a brother that's dying in the hospital and they don't know that they're saved yet, and they want you to go in there and save the day, and there's an eternity at stake here. Those are big consequences for someone to carry. You know, you could do other jobs, and there might certainly be some consequences, but they're not always eternal consequences.
Right.
It's not a matter of life and death or salvation or damnation. And so it might, or divorce or happy marriage. And so you carry that weight upon you, someone's eternal salvation. I better not mess up this sermon that I'm preaching on this week, or this counsel. A couple, their last shot at not getting divorced, and they've agreed to come talk to me. What do I say? The enormous pressure sometimes.
No kidding.
And then an eighth thing is that pastors are supposed to always behave like Jesus, even though the people they're working with don't have to play by the same rules. And I've literally known people that they had estranged themselves from everyone else, or they had zero people skills and had no friends, but they could still, you're the pastor, like you have to be nice to them. And they could be rude to you, and they could make all kinds of hurtful comments, but you've got to keep being kind and gracious. And that can also wear after a while, where they don't have to be subtle. They can just tell you what they think. But boy, my goodness, if you ever told them straight what you thought, the whole church would hear about it. And so, again, the pressure of that.
Are you saying there are people in congregations
I know,
in
not
churches
in any church
today
I've been in, but I have heard some.
that have difficult people?
Just the last couple things, maybe just three. So the ninth one is just, and again, this can, in some ways, this can be similar for other folks as well, but you have to live down what your predecessors did, or you have to live up to it one way or the other. If you follow a pastor that just was like near sainthood, you've got to be secure enough to hear about that. Or maybe the former guy was immoral. Maybe he was a tyrant. Maybe he divided the church, and there's all kinds of turmoil swirling about. And now you come in. And one thing I had to learn early as a pastor was that a lot of the issues that people were having were not my issues. They were the former person's issues.
Yeah.
These people were still mad about it, and now they're going to take it out on me. And I'm like, what's the deal? Why are you mad at me? I've not done anything. well, they're really mad at a former guy, but he's gone, so they're going to take it out on me now. And if the former guy was not trustworthy, then they're not going to trust you. If the former guy disappointed people, they're watching carefully for when you might disappoint them. And so it's not fair. You'd hope that people would just take you solely on who you are and on your record, but or the last person was a superhero, and now they expect you to do the same thing. There's a famous story about the pastor that came to the new church, and one of the widows came up to him and said, Pastor, the former brother or pastor, he came over every Saturday morning and he mowed my lawn for me for free. Did it for 20 years, and just always really appreciated that he did that for me. And so the pastor said, well, sister, you know what? I was just talking with him, and he says he doesn't want to do that anymore. but sometimes because the former guy did something that maybe that was fine, that was his thing, but it's not necessarily your thing. Yeah. But now you follow that, and then the last two things is 10th thing is that there is enormous spiritual warfare, and in one sense, spiritual warfare is all around us, but it's certainly focuses in on the church and the work of the church and the ministry. And so there is a unique way in which, as you lead a church and you try to be salt and light, you try to help people be transformed into saints, that Satan hates that. Satan, if you're going to be carnal and lazy and unchristlike, Satan's laughing all the way to the bank. But you actually try to start expanding the kingdom, and you're now on Satan's radar. And there are some horrific things that have happened in churches and have been led to attack pastors that were just, it was more satanic driven than anything. And you just sometimes wonder, why on earth would anybody treat a pastor that way? And it's because they're an instrument of evil. And so be aware of that. And then the last thing I would just say is, one of the challenges of being a pastor is that you're always giving, but oftentimes not receiving. Pastors are every time you walk in the building, you're ministering. You pass a church member in a Walmart, you just ran in to pick something up, but now they're pouring out their problems to you in the cereal aisle, and you've got to stop and hear their concerns, and they may not be that sensitive to the fact that you've got a family waiting for you back at home. You're their pastor, so you've got to just stop what you're doing, and whatever they're concerned about has got to be a priority for you as well. And
I think so many church members can, I think, mistakenly get the idea that they have there's an obligation of the pastor to meet them at any point, It's
almost like I've got my own personal counselor, cheerleader on retainer.
It's like, so
whenever I'm having a bad day, I can just call up my pastor and he'll make me feel better. Yeah. And of course, maybe some of that has changed, but not. There's a lot of folks who still do things that way. Mm-hmm. And so what I find when I'm encouraging pastors, a lot of what I do. Earlier this week, I was in a couple of meetings with pastors and just kind of helping them understand, how do you keep your cup full when you're constantly pouring out life and encouragement to others. And so that becomes a huge challenge, is you give and give and give. And sometimes that's what leads to burnout ultimately, is you've given so much and you just haven't taken in nearly as much back in. And one day you just have nothing left. And I've known literally pastors who couldn't get off the couch anymore, or they just were crying and couldn't stop. And they're like, what is going on with me? And they hit empty, and they were at empty for too long. And there's actually a surprising, tragic number of pastors who commit suicide every year, because they can't handle it anymore. And so those are 11 needs. And if I were just share one or two things, so in light of all that, and maybe even as you're listening to this, you're thinking, man, I don't know that I had any idea that my pastor might face all that kind of stuff. I wish there was something I could do. Well, I'm glad you said that. Two things maybe I would just say. One is be sure that you do express your appreciation. Let them know. And for instance, if you're there and they preached a sermon in the church service today, that's fine to say, hey, good sermon today, preacher. But it always means a lot more if you're actually specific. Because, anybody can just say, enjoyed the sermon today. But take a moment and say, hey, I'd never heard that passage unfolded that way. I never thought about that, the way you talked about what Jesus did or said, or when you applied it that way. That was so good. It tells them that you were listening, that you were processing, and all that work and study and delivery paid off in your life. And so, and also be also appreciative of the service that they provide for you. And it's kind of a tricky thing. Like, I know when I was a pastor, if a church member was going to get married, or they're going to get buried, or other things, they just kind of assumed that as their pastor, I would provide that. And I felt like that was a service, that they're a member of our church, so they get those services. But and I never charged anybody. But I'll tell you what, like, weddings are actually very. I've had people say they far prefer doing funerals than weddings, and it sounds kind of morbid and crazy, but the fact is, you don't do premarital counseling with funerals. Funerals are a much sadder occasion, obviously, but you basically come in and do a short service, maybe go by the graveside, but you don't meet for 6 to 8 weeks of counseling ahead of time, and
there's not a rehearsal.
It's not a rehearsal, and it's usually over a weekend, Friday night, Saturday morning, prime time to be home with your family. Yeah. Funerals a lot of times might be somewhere in the week when you're working anyway as a pastor, but and so don't just assume that, well, he's my pastor, he has to do that for me. I'll tell you what, gift cards are great. I've had people, I've done weddings for folks, and they even asked me and said, "What do you charge?" And usually it's been for someone I cared about, because I'm not a pastor of a church right now, but I've also would say, listen, I'll just leave that up to you. I'm not going to charge anything, but hey, I'm always happy to be thanked.
You're not going to refuse.
Yeah, and so I've had people that will give me a gift card somewhere nice, so my wife and I can go out for dinner or something like that. That's always really appreciated. Don't just presume on your minister, but realize, and a lot of times the minister will go above and beyond. Maybe that was kind of their job, but you know what? They went the extra mile, and they obviously really care. And it's funny to me because I've done weddings before where I was doing all kinds of counseling and rehearsals and checking on all kinds of things. And then if it's a wedding, like I'm also giving a gift, like I'm giving them something. And then sometimes it's just almost assumed. I've had people, though, that didn't give me anything or hardly thank me for it. Just that's what they were expected to do. So when you have the opportunity, when you see that someone has ministered in some way, express your thanks for that. And then the second thing I would just say is just try to be a blessing to your pastor. And I hope that all of our listeners are being blessed by their pastor. Not every pastor, unfortunately, is a blessing, but if you're one of those that you feel like, you know what, we're fortunate, we've got a good person that cares about us and he's shepherding us, then find ways, especially to bless him, but bless their family as well. I've got a soft spot in my heart for pastors' kids, and so whenever I see someone who's grown up in a minister's home, I always try particularly to just encourage them and show interest in them. If you go to like a public school and your dad's a pastor, like that caused me a number of fights in the playground. You're assumed to be maybe a sissy or a goody two shoes or something, and it can be tough. And so you're at church a lot because your dad's a pastor. You might be the last one to leave church. Find some ways just to make it fun for the pastor's kid. Bless them, and maybe bring gifts for them sometimes, or think about them for their birthday. I know people that just love to provide little gifts for the pastor and his especially if it's for their family. I've had people throughout the years that perhaps had maybe a cabin somewhere that I couldn't afford to go to, but they let their pastor use it, or things that they might have, or just maybe invite you to come along for dinner. I remember when we were quite poor starting out, couldn't really afford to go out and eat very much, but in restaurants. But we had some deacons that would periodically just take us out or have us over to their home and just give us a nice meal and just love on us. And I'll tell you what, I had a handful of people that did that for me and my family, and it helped me get through some really tough times. We lost my mother-in-law over a sort of prolonged period of illness, and my wife and I were separated for a month while she was caring for her dying mother, and I was trying to take one of our kids and have them in school every day, and it was tough. But we had some church members who just really stepped up, and one lady that would just watch our little daughter, Carrie, your wife, when the other two boys were in school, but she was still a preschooler. There was a wonderful woman that would just watch Carrie in the morning, so Lisa and I could go have coffee together. And I remember that on Thursday mornings. She was just it was such a breath of fresh air just for my wife and I, just to have an hour and a half or so, 2 hours of coffee together, and just some free childcare like that. And that kind of thing. If you're creative, just and certainly pray for your pastor. And as you pray, God might just put something on your heart specifically that you can do. If you have a resource that you can share, if you've got the finances, perhaps to give them a gift card now and then. I'll tell you what, it's when a pastor is suddenly given a gift card and they can take their whole family out to eat. That's a huge gift. So while you're in this month, you may have a pastor that gets paid well. Maybe they make more money than you do, but you can still thank them and find some way to encourage them and let them know that you're one person who just really appreciates all the effort that they go to be the best minister they can be for you.
Yeah, well, that's good, and that I think wholeheartedly second that motion, and appreciate you taking us through this, Richard. And we are grateful for all the pastors out there, and we thank you for your service. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.